You may have the courage to look up.
We've had triumphs. We made some mistakes.
For 40 years, United States foreign policy was guided by the paradigm of containment of the Soviet Union. It was always easy for us to know what to do in a given situation. If the Soviet Union was for it, we were against it. If we were for it, they were against it. And we were going to contain the growth and spread of communism.
For more than 40 years, the threat that Soviet communism would spread was at the heart of the United States foreign policy. During the Cold War, we could clearly identify the enemy and plan strategy to overcome it. But with the dismantling of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the threat of communist expansion all but disappeared. What will now take its place as the central principle guiding foreign policy?
I have a statement by the President of the United States. The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
In January of 1991, the United States military target wasn't communist aggression. It was the protection of Middle East oil. Iraq and President Saddam Hussein had ignored a deadline for withdrawing troops from neighboring Kuwait. So the United States and a multinational force attacked Iraqi defense installations. The conflict with Iraq, the Gulf War, marked a new model for United States military involvement. Instead of standing alone in challenging Iraq, the United States sought the support of the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council agreed to condemn the Iraqi invasion and back economic sanctions against Iraq. Then it went further by endorsing a military operation.
The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 678, 1990. We thought it was important to go through the Security Council for two reasons. First, we didn't want to be accused of running a cowboy-type operation, America alone. We would like to have had and ended up getting the support of many Arab governments. The second reason it was important was to build domestic political support here in the United States. When we first started talking about going to war in the Gulf, it was a highly unpopular idea. But once we were able to bring, in effect, the rest of the world, almost the rest of the world, behind the operation, we were then in position to go to a senator or a congressman and say, Senator or Congressman, you mean you're not going to support the President of the United States, but the President of Ethiopia is supporting him?
As President Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker played a key role in building domestic support and international support. One potential obstacle was the Soviet Union. But in this instance, the Soviets stood with the United States in condemning Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. This alliance was precedent-setting.
By getting the Soviet Union on board early and being able to keep them there, and it wasn't a simple matter keeping them on board, but by doing that, we made it clear to the rest of the international community that this was indeed a really egregious act. And the Soviet Union was willing to condemn its own client state, and we further made it clear that there wasn't going to be a Soviet veto down the line that would cut off international action.
Gaining the backing of other UN countries also required diplomacy.
I traveled a lot. I visited the head of every country on the Security Council. I remember one trip I took when I was in the air, I think 38 hours. President Bush did an extraordinary amount of work on the telephone with these leaders. Margaret Thatcher, who was a steadfast ally and supporter, was very much against going through the United Nations. She felt that the United States and the United Kingdom should just go get the job done. We had to work very hard in some instances to cobble together the support. Two countries voted no. I think Cuba and Yemen were the only two that voted no. China abstained, and the other 12 countries, there are 15 on the Security Council, voted yes for the use of force resolution.
I could not accept the loss of life of any of our children in the Persian Gulf right now, and that tells me that in my gut, I do not believe that it's time to go to war.
I see no compelling reason to rush to military action.
In the face of congressional opposition, President Bush enlisted his national security team. His Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All were friends. All had worked together in the Reagan administration. President Bush wanted them to devise a war plan and help convince Congress to pass a resolution of support.
We work well together, and we were not out to undermine and undercut each other and backbite and leak adverse material on one another in the press. So we were able to make it really work and function effectively.
But reaching consensus on a war plan wasn't easy. Some United States military leaders were also reluctant to send troops to Iraq, and President Bush believed the first war plan submitted by generals would risk too many American lives.
They presented a plan where it was right up the middle, right into the teeth of the Iraqi forces. And Secretary Cheney and General Scowcroft, his National Security Advisor, thought that was not appropriate, and so advised the President. The President said, sent it back to him, said, come up with another plan, and by the way, I'm going to let the military fight this war. We're not going to fight this war from the White House and make political decisions that are going to tie the hands of the military. And I'm going to give you everything you want. You tell me what you want. How many aircraft carriers, how many squadrons of airplanes, how many men. The President never turned down any request of the military for additional assets, and that's one reason we were able to fight the war as expeditiously and efficiently as we were.
In January of 1991, when the United States led a multinational coalition into Iraq, it was with a plan that called for the use of overwhelming force. The goal was to limit casualties and quickly subdue the Iraqis. The first phase of the war was fought from the air. For about a month, United States fighters blasted the Iraqis with the help of technology that attempted to zero in on enemy targets. The Iraqis reacted with Scud missiles. The United States and allies responded with Patriot missiles intended to intercept the Scuds in mid-flight. But the effect of technology did not stop there.
This is CNN.
Now, the anti-aircraft fire has slowed down again. What we saw are about 5 bombs dropped in the center of
Watching the Gulf War as it happened was the American public, the Bush administration, and Saddam Hussein.
David, all day long there have been indications
We found early on that the most effective way to reach the enemy, in effect, or even our allies, was for President Bush to go, let's say, out in the Rose Garden, go out on CNN. We knew that Saddam Hussein was sitting there in his bunker watching the show, watching CNN, and we could communicate face-to-face and directly rather than having to send a message through an ambassador and that sort of thing. So it changed things in that respect significantly.
It's always been the case that leaders, political, business, academic, try and use the media to influence outcome. And that translates into the present time when I think, yes, people try and use CNN. It is incumbent all the more, therefore, on us to make sure that we give the head of state an opportunity to make his or her point, but then to go to the opposition, to go outside the country to people who have a different point of view, and to try and get as much balance to the story as we can so that the viewer then has more than just a head of state, more than just George Bush or Bill Clinton or Saddam Hussein or Margaret Thatcher or whomever, and has differing points of view from which they can make up their own lives.
In the end, the Gulf War plan worked. After 100 days of fighting on land, the Gulf War was over. Iraq's military was defeated. In the face of international aggression, United States leaders had shown they could marshal multinational support to defeat Iraq. With cutting-edge technology and overwhelming force, they had attacked and quickly concluded the conflict. And the former Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, had become a military ally.
Pour améliorer notre sécurité commune et renforcer.
Donde primen los valores de libertad, democracia y respeto a los derechos individuales.
Today, NATO members have agreed to invite the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland to begin accession talks with NATO.
In July of 1997, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, invited 3 new countries to join them in a military pact to defend each other's borders. The invitation was groundbreaking because for much of the past 50 years, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia had been adversaries allied with the former Soviet Union. But with the end of the Cold War, the 3 nations had established democratic governments. Their strategic location in Central Europe would extend the NATO alliance further east.
We are now having this discussion in this country about Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary joining NATO. What they're really doing is joining the Democratic Club, which they very much want to join. But of course, to do so, they've got to meet certain standards.
NATO dates back to the end of World War II. The United States and Western Europe formed the alliance to counter the Soviet military buildup in Central and Eastern Europe. To that end, United States troops were stationed in Western Europe, and nuclear weapons pointed at the Soviet Union. After the Soviet breakup, however, the number of NATO troops was cut, and there was talk of disbanding NATO entirely. The proposed expansion provoked heated objections from some members of Congress.
Why would we be thinking of adding new members to this alliance? It seems to me that the argument about U.S. leadership being diluted is much more relevant to the question of whether there should be new members.
Expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era.
We have taken a giant stride in our efforts to create a Europe that is undivided, democratic, and at peace.
NATO expansion will be a double whammy for United States taxpayers. They will wind up subsidizing U.S. arms merchants in a venture that will bring them less, not more, security.
Well, what they've done is they just reminded me that we've got to sell Congress on 2 things, and one is Congress would have to agree to ratify an amendment to the NATO treaty, putting in new members, and the second is that we would have to agree to pay our portion of the cost of integrating those new members.
Secretary of State Madeleine Albright supported expansion, which she told Congress would integrate new democracies, defeat old hatreds, provide confidence in economic recovery, and deter conflict.
I think Secretary Albright's doing exactly what she ought to be doing on the NATO expansion. She's promoting it. She's strongly supportive of it. It's a Clinton administration initiative, and she's testified before the Congress and testified quite capably in support of it. That's the way a Secretary of State has to operate in order to get a foreign policy initiative through the Congress. The most important thing she can do and has done is to lay out the rationale for NATO expansion and to answer the questions that lawmakers might have about the expansion and to rebut the negatives that they might throw out.
Secretary Albright helped convince Congress that NATO's readiness to defend 3 more nations would not break the bank, but would strengthen the alliance.
It's not just us paying for other people. It's primarily the countries themselves who have to pull up their boots and develop military institutions that are compatible with our own. I think a more serious concern in the minds of some about NATO expansion would be, would this send a negative signal to the leadership in Russia and lead them to feel that they were now facing some new kind of confrontation or expansion in the direction of their boundaries. My own view on that is that if there are countries in that region that have wanted to join the West, it shouldn't be the West that prevents them from doing so, and the Russians have not earned a veto over that process. But that said, we've got to make this also a win-win, and so we are reaching out to the Russians.
Some suggest that in the end, reaching out could even mean inviting Russia into the alliance.
No European democracy should be excluded from ultimate consideration. And I have said that I believe my personal position is that should apply to Russia as well, that any democratic country.
Suppose Russia continues to reform and embrace free markets and the rule of law and democratic principles the way Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic have. Why should we say that Russia would be excluded? Why shouldn't the most successful security alliance in history, the North Atlantic Alliance, be the security alliance for all of Eurasia that is willing to embrace those principles and values that the countries of NATO have always embraced?
In mid-1998, in the wake of strong campaigning by the Clinton administration, the expansion of NATO gathered support. When it came to a vote, more than the required 2/3 of the Senate said yes, confirming the United States' approval for the expansion. And with that expansion, NATO would enter a new era. But in fact, NATO had already changed, and the United States was a big part of that. For 4 decades of Soviet tension, NATO troops had never deployed to fulfill their obligation, to defend a member under attack. Now, however, United States soldiers under the NATO banner were in Bosnia enforcing a peace treaty, even though Bosnia itself was not a member of NATO. NATO was finding new ways to achieve its objective, the stability of Europe. The visit of Pope John Paul II to communist Cuba was unprecedented. For opponents of Fidel Castro's government, it inspired hope that the pontiff would further a goal they had long sought, the end of Castro's regime. Nowhere was that hope more fervent than 90 miles offshore in the Miami, Florida broadcast studios of the Cuban-American National Foundation. For decades, the organization has represented Cuban exiles who fled their homeland following Castro's 1959 revolution. The group vehemently opposes Castro and has worked hard to overthrow him. One of the ways they do that is through radio broadcasts beamed into Cuba with the help of United States taxpayer dollars. As the Pope called for humanitarian rights in Cuba, the Cuban-American National Foundation provided its analysis for listeners.
I had a lawyer and I had a priest, and we analyzed the contents of the Pope's message, which I think in a sense is very helpful to the Cuban people on the island, because this is the first time that they are able to experience that someone like the Pope comes to Cuba and in front of the dictator tells the Cuban people that they have the right and the obligation to take control of their children's education. And this is a way to defy a totalitarian state that has controlled that education.
The broadcasts are only one of the tools the organization uses to influence attitudes and public policy towards communist Cuba. Its many thousand members wield political clout at the ballot box in cities like Miami, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where there are large Cuban populations. The group is also active in Washington, where it lobbies lawmakers, makes large political contributions, and has access to the highest elected officials. In 1994, for example, when the United States closed its borders to Cuban exiles arriving in rafts, the Cuban American National Foundation went right to the top with its protest.
The chairman of the organization met with President Clinton, and he told them exactly what his views were. And I think that through all these hard years of serious work, the foundation has and is recognized as an organization that people take seriously whenever there is a decision to be made about Cuba.
The Cuban American National Foundation has also supported other anti-Castro efforts that have made Cuba one of the few remaining symbols of Cold War policy. Since 1961, 2 years after communist Fidel Castro came to power, the United States has imposed an embargo of goods to Cuba. In July of 1996, at the urging of many Cuban exiles, President Clinton signed a law that went even further in strengthening our anti-Castro policy. The Helms-Burton Law threatens punishment for foreign companies if they do business with Cuba. The act, if enforced, cuts off foreign aid to those countries and allows United States courts to prosecute. Helms-Burton has angered many U.S. allies like Canada. Every year, the United Nations overwhelmingly opposes the sanctions.
Every time that resolution comes true, I think that the U.S. is usually totally isolated, perhaps with the exception of 2 or 3 countries. The whole world disagrees with this, the policy of embargo at Cuba. We perfectly recognize, of course, the right of the U.S. to deal with Cuba and Cubans the way you want. But we also feel that we have the same sovereign right to deal with Cuba the way we want. And we think that by implementing a law like Helms-Burton, you're making what is a bilateral political problem between you and Cuba into a broader multilateral trade and investment problem for the whole world. This is not correct.
Okay. El sentir de la clase trabajadora cubana en este 28 de enero que marca otro aniversario.
While citizens groups alone don't dictate U.S. policy regarding Cuba, they can be important.
In an open democracy like the United States, citizens have a tremendous influence on any policy, whether it's domestic or foreign. They can lobby their elected representatives. They can band together and spend money on television or newspaper advertisements to generate support for their position. And you see this all the time in many, many different ways, shapes, and forms. Almost any country you can think of has some interest group in this country that is promoting its interests.
And those interests can influence official government action. The Irish National Caucus, for example, is a registered political action committee that lobbies Congress to promote the interests of Northern Ireland's Catholics. The Irish lobby is credited with convincing President Clinton's administration to give a visa to Gerry Adams, head of Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican Army's political arm. The Clinton administration also became involved in mediating a ceasefire and establishing talks which resulted in an historic peace agreement for Northern Ireland. Since the 1950s, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has promoted Israel's interests on Capitol Hill and in the White House. It takes credit for the United States' longtime position as a staunch ally and supporter of Israel. It claims to hold 1,000 meetings each year with lawmakers who will vote on issues affecting Israel. When it comes to Cuba, critics of the embargo question why the United States will meet with other communist governments like those in China or North Korea, but not with Cuba.
The difference is these other nations have taken steps to accommodate U.S. policy interests. Maybe not as far as we'd like them to go, but they've indicated they will move at least in a little bit and move in our direction. It's there that you can have a dialogue and negotiation. Cuba has not indicated a willingness to move at all.
Not at least until the visit of Pope John Paul. In his own way, the Pope chastised both the United States and Cuba. He criticized the United States embargo and Cuba's holding of political prisoners. And as many hoped, the Pope's visit brought some results. Castro announced he would free more than 200 prisoners, including dissidents. President Clinton then agreed to authorize some direct flights between the United States and Cuba, and he allowed Cuban Americans for the first time in several years to send money to relatives in their homeland. The Cuban American National Foundation even softened its rhetoric, proposing for the first time since the Castro Revolution that food and medicine be sent to Cuba. How it should be done was still at issue, but there was little question the group let politicians here and in Cuba know their views.
De la Confederación de Trabajadores Democráticos de Cuba.
It's extraordinarily important for the United States to remain engaged in the world, because when we're engaged, we promote peace and stability. We are a force for peace and stability. And that engagement is very, very important. But it ought to be selective, particularly with respect to the commitment of U.S. forces, military forces, which could result in deaths of American men and women.
We haven't yet found that answer for the, what is the next strategic paradigm? There are a lot of possibilities. Some people are saying the next strategic paradigm is environmental protection on a global basis. Some people are saying it's dealing with ethnic conflict. Some people are saying it's preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or building new institutional regimes for security in Africa or Asia, wherever. But what I'm saying is there's no unified concept.
Not only did the end of the Cold War eliminate the focus for U.S. foreign policy, it changed the way we operate within traditional institutions like NATO and the United Nations.
I think that multilateral institutions, international institutions like that, should never in and of themselves be an end of U.S. foreign policy. Multilateralism as such should never be an end of U.S. foreign policy, but it is an important means to accomplish U.S. foreign policy goals. And we should continue to be a part of those institutions and to support them, because they give us much greater added leverage in making our foreign policy and, frankly, our international economic decisions.